Chum. She slammed her hand on the hood of a $2 million car and screamed at 7 of the most expensive engineers in America. Fix it or get out of my building. 6 weeks, 43 specialists, 0 answers. Then a single dad in a worn-out jacket walked through her door carrying nothing but an old metal toolbox, and she almost laughed him out of the room. She didn't know he was about to make every one of those experts look like amateurs. And she really didn't know what it would cost her to almost turn him away. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now because this one's going to stay with you. Amelia Vaughn didn't ask for opinions. She gave them. At 47, she had built Vaughn Motor Group from a regional dealership chain into one of the most respected names in American luxury automotive. Her company had revenues north of $3 billion a year. Her name was on the cover of Forbes Automotive Executive, and no fewer than 4 business journals in the last decade alone. She had shaken hands with senators, closed deals in Geneva, and once turned down an acquisition offer from a German conglomerate so large that her own board of directors thought she had lost her mind. She hadn't lost her mind. She had simply made a decision, and Amelia Vaughn did not lose decisions. That was the thing about her that people didn't fully understand until they worked for her. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was a kind of absolute certainty that had been forged over 22 years of being told she couldn't, wouldn't, and shouldn't, and then doing it anyway. She had outlasted 3 male CEOs who'd been promoted above her. She had rebuilt the company's engine division from the ground up after a catastrophic supplier failure that should have bankrupted them. She had done things that people in boardrooms still talked about with a mixture of admiration and low-level fear. So when the car started giving her problems, she wasn't worried. She was annoyed. The vehicle in question was not something you could walk into a dealership and buy. It was a one-of-one commission, a bespoke supercar that her own engineers had spent 2.5 years designing specifically for her. Carbon fiber body, handcrafted interior, a twin turbocharged V12 engine that her team had spent months tuning to a level of performance that shouldn't have been physically possible for a street-legal vehicle. It was by any reasonable measure a mechanical masterpiece. It was also, for reasons nobody could explain, broken. Not dramatically broken, not smoke pouring from the hood broken. That would have been almost easier to deal with. As it was broken in the infuriating, elusive way that only machines built at the absolute edge of their capability seemed to break with hesitation. A half-second stutter at certain RPMs. A tremor in the throttle response that lasted less than a heartbeat before vanishing. Sensors that flickered at the edge of tolerance without ever triggering a warning code. Something was wrong. But every diagnostic tool in her facility said the car was perfect. Amelia had put 7 specialists on it. 7. Her head of diagnostics, 2 senior engineers from the original build team, a performance consultant from Europe who charged $12,000 a day, an outside firm that specialized in exactly this kind of intermittent fault analysis. A retired Formula One engineer, her VP of technology, had called in as a personal favor. And finally, out of what she later admitted was desperation, a data analytics company that had never worked on a car in their lives, but were very good at finding hidden patterns in complex systems. 6 weeks later, the car still stuttered. And every single one of those experts had stood in her facility, looked her in the eye, and delivered the same verdict in slightly different words. There's nothing wrong with the car. The morning it all changed started badly. Amelia was at her desk by 5:45 a.m., which was not unusual. What was unusual was the email sitting at the top of her inbox from her head of diagnostics, a man named Garrett Pruitt, who had been with the company for 11 years and who she trusted generally to solve problems rather than document why they couldn't be solved. The email was 3 paragraphs long, and the 3rd paragraph contained the sentence, "At this point, I think we have to accept that whatever the driver is experiencing may be perceptual rather than mechanical." Amelia read it twice. Then she picked up her phone and called him. He answered on the second ring. Garrett? Good morning, Amelia. Are you telling me, she said, keeping her voice very level, that you think I'm imagining it? A pause. I'm saying that our instruments aren't detecting. Garrett. Her voice dropped slightly, which everyone on her staff knew was worse than when she raised it. I have driven that car 14 times. The hesitation occurs between 4,000 and 4,500 revolutions per minute under hard acceleration. It lasts approximately half a second. It is consistent, it is repeatable, and it is not something I am imagining. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Another pause. Longer this time. Yes, he said. Then find it. She hung up. But the recommendation came from an unlikely source. Her personal assistant, a sharp 29-year-old named Diana, who had an almost supernatural ability to know things before Amelia asked for them, knocked on her office door at just after 10 that morning. I know you didn't ask, Diana said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. But I heard about what Garrett sent this morning. Everyone heard about it. I have a name. Amelia looked up from her screen. A name. A mechanic. He's local, well about 40 minutes out. Small operation. He's not famous. He's not on any of the industry lists. He doesn't have a website with testimonials from racing teams. Diana paused. But my uncle used to take his cars to this man's father, and now he takes them to the son. He says the guy can find things that computers can't. Amelia leaned back in her chair. She looked at Diana for a long moment. What's his background? He's been working on cars since he was a kid, learned from his father. He has his own shop, Cole's Auto, over on Millbrook Road. Diana hesitated. It's not a fancy place. Does he have experience with high-performance vehicles? He has experience with everything. That's kind of the thing about him. He doesn't specialize. Amelia returned to her screen. Send the analysts the raw sensor data from last Tuesday's test run. I want a fresh set of eyes on the throttle response data. Amelia, Diana's voice was careful. I really think you should call this man. A silence stretched between them. What's his name? Ethan Cole. She didn't call him that day. She spent the afternoon in a 3-hour session with the data analytics firm, watching two men with PhDs in applied mathematics build a probability model for the fault pattern using the last 6 weeks of test data. It was meticulous work. It was expensive work. At the end of 3 hours, they had produced a 40-page report and a conclusion that the fault was most likely a sensor calibration drift that would resolve itself as the engine continued to break in. Amelia thanked them, walked them to the elevator, came back to the conference room, and sat down alone. She thought about the 40-page report. She thought about 6 weeks and 7 specialists. She thought about the way the car felt under her hands, the very particular and very real sensation of something that was wrong. Then she picked up her phone and called Diana. Get me Ethan Cole's number. He answered on the 4th ring. Not with a business greeting, not with Cole's Auto, how can I help you? Just a simple, slightly distracted. Hello? Is this Ethan Cole? Yeah. A sound in the background, something mechanical, something being set down on a hard surface. Who's this? My name is Amelia Vaughn. I'm the CEO of Vaughn Motor Group. A beat. Okay, he said. Not oh my God or seriously just okay, like she'd told him her name was Susan. She found that mildly irritating. I've been told you're good at finding mechanical problems that other people can't. I try to be. I have a vehicle, a bespoke commission, our own build. It's been showing an intermittent fault for 6 weeks and 7 specialists haven't been able to identify it. I'd like you to come and take a look. Silence. Not a long silence, but not an immediate one either. She had the sense he was actually thinking it over rather than simply calculating how to say yes as fast as possible. "What kind of fault?" he asked. She explained it: the RPM range, the throttle behavior, the sensor data. She was concise. She gave him the information without editorializing. He asked 2 questions. Specific technical questions about the intake system configuration and the turbocharger response curve. She answered them. "Okay," he said again. "I can come Thursday." "I need you to come tomorrow." Another pause. "I have a daughter. She's 8. I do school pickup at 3:15. Amelia blinked. She hadn't expected that. "We'll be done well before 3:15, she said. "Then I'll see you tomorrow." He arrived at 8:50 in the morning. The facility was Vaughn Motor Group's private performance center. 40,000 square feet of climate-controlled workspace with diagnostic equipment that cost more than most small hospitals, and a staff of technicians who had collectively forgotten more about automotive engineering than most people ever learn. Amelia watched from the mezzanine as Ethan Cole walked through the main entrance.
Billionaire.
He was in his early 40s, medium height, the kind of build that came from physical work rather than a gym. He wore a plain dark jacket over a flannel shirt, and he was carrying, and this was the part that stuck with her that she kept coming back to later, an old metal toolbox. The kind with the hinged lid and the sliding tray inside. Not a professional-grade rollaway cart. Not a branded case full of precision instruments. A toolbox that looked like it might have belonged to his father. Around him, her technicians in their company-branded uniforms and her engineers in their pressed shirts watched him cross the floor. She could read the room from above. Skepticism. Amusement barely contained. The specific social discomfort of people who knew they were supposed to be professional but were having trouble taking this seriously. Garrett Pruitt was standing near the car. When Ethan approached him and extended his hand, Garrett shook it, but his posture was a closed door. Amelia came downstairs.
"Mr. Cole?"
she said.
"Thank you for coming."
He looked at her directly. Not deferential, not challenging, just steady. "Thanks for the call," he said. He glanced around the facility, not the wide-eyed look of someone impressed, but the quick scanning assessment of someone mapping the space. Then his eyes settled on the car. He walked to it, too. He didn't reach for it immediately. He stood beside it for a moment. And then he did something that made Garrett actually turn to look at Amelia with an expression that said, "Is he serious? Ethan?" Cole leaned slightly forward, tilted his head, and appeared to simply look at the car. Not at the diagnostics panel, not at the report Garrett had ready on the tablet, at the car itself. "Can I hear the engine?" he asked. "Of course." Amelia reached for the key. Not yet. He held up one hand, still not looking at her, looking at the car. "In a minute. First, I want to just look at it for a second." Nobody spoke. The silence in the room had a particular texture to it. Garrett cleared his throat quietly. Ethan didn't acknowledge it. He moved slowly around the car, not quickly, not with the brisk efficiency of someone running through a checklist. Slowly. His eyes moved from the bodywork to the visible mechanical components along the roofline, down to the wheel arches. He crouched briefly at the front quarter panel and looked at something she couldn't see from where she was standing. He stood back up. Then he looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Start it up." Amelia got behind the wheel. The engine turned over that magnificent controlled thunder that she had spent 2.5 years helping to create. She looked at Ethan through the windshield. He was standing 6 feet from the front of the car, and he had his eyes closed. One of the junior engineers made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Something adjacent to one. Amelia shot a look through the glass that silenced the room. She brought the RPMs up slowly, watching the gauges, feeling the familiar build of torque through the seat and the floor. Through the windshield, Ethan's face was completely still. His eyes remained closed. His head was tilted very slightly, the posture of someone listening to music and trying to pick out a single instrument from an orchestra. She pushed through 3,500. 4,000. And then his hand came up. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand raised, fingers slightly spread. She eased off. He opened his eyes, walked to the driver's side window. She lowered it. "Do it again," he said. "Same thing. Push it to about 4,200 and hold it there for 2 seconds. She did. The engine climbed. 4,100. 4,200. And there it was, the stutter. So brief, so slight. The kind of thing that data said shouldn't exist. And she watched Ethan's face change. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a small thing, a slight narrowing of the eyes. Recognition. "Okay," he said. "Turn it off." She killed the engine. The room was very quiet. Ethan walked around to the passenger side, crouched down near the front of the car, and peered into the visible section of the intake system. He reached in, not deep, just at the edge of the accessible section. He looked up at Garrett. "Is there a way to pull access to the lower intake section without full disassembly?" Garrett blinked. "That's yes. There's a service panel on the underside, but our team already—" "I know," Ethan said. "It wasn't unkind. Is there a lift I can use?" 12 minutes later, the car was elevated, and Ethan Cole was lying on a creeper underneath it. Nobody spoke. Amelia stood with her arms folded, watching the bottom of the car, where one pair of legs extended from underneath. She could hear sounds, careful sounds, deliberate sounds. A wrench being repositioned. A breath. A pause. Then his voice from under the car. "Garrett." Garrett crouched down. "Yeah." "Come look at this." Garrett slid under the lift on a second creeper. A few seconds of silence. Then from underneath the car, in a voice that was trying very hard not to be what it was, "Oh." Amelia crouched down. "What is it?" Garrett's voice came back hollow with disbelief. "A clamp," he said. "What?" Ethan slid out from under the car and sat up. He looked up at her from the floor, completely calm, completely without judgment. "A clamp on the lower intake junction," he said. "It's not failed. It's just slightly loose. Half a turn. Under normal operating load, you'd never feel it. But at that RPM range, under hard acceleration, the intake pressure differential causes a microflex in the junction housing. It's so small, the sensors can't register it as a fault, but the airflow disruption is just enough to cause a momentary imbalance in the fuel-air mixture." He paused. "That's your stutter." "Bye." The room was completely silent. Amelia looked at Garrett. Garrett was still half under the car. His face, what she could see of it, was the face of a man reassembling something internal. She looked back at Ethan. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that 7 specialists spent 6 weeks analyzing thousands of data points, and the problem was a loose clamp." Ethan picked up his wrench. "They were looking at the data," he said simply. "I was listening to the car." He turned and slid back under. The repair took 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Amelia timed it. When she started the engine again, the room gathered closer than they should have been for professional detachment, but nobody said anything about it. She brought the RPMs up, through 4,500, through 5,000, smooth, completely, entirely, perfectly smooth, no hesitation, no stutter, no ghost in the machine. For a long moment, Amelia sat in the driver's seat with the engine running, hands on the wheel, and didn't say anything. Outside the car, nobody spoke either. She turned the engine off. She got out. And Ethan Cole was standing beside his old metal toolbox, wiping his hands on a cloth, looking not triumphant, not smug, just finished. The way a man looks when he's done a thing that needed to be done. Amelia stood 3 feet from him. She had been called a lot of things in her career. Decisive, visionary, ruthless by people who didn't know her well enough to understand the difference between ruthlessness and precision. Nobody had ever made her feel in the space of 2 hours quite like this. Mr. Cole, she said. Ethan's fine. Ethan. She held his gaze. I owe you an apology. He looked faintly surprised. What for? C'est-il-si? She didn't answer that immediately, because the honest answer would have required her to say, for every thought I had when you walked through that door. For the way I watched you cross this floor, and mentally cataloged everything about you that didn't fit my idea of expertise. For the 12 assumptions I made in the first 4 minutes about what you could and couldn't know. Instead, she said, for making you drive 40 minutes for a loose clamp. He almost smiled. I've driven further, he said, and then, because it was 2:40 in the afternoon, I should get going. School pickup. He picked up his toolbox, and he walked toward the door. The engineers in that room would talk about what happened next. Not publicly, professionals don't talk publicly about being made to feel like students, but quietly in the way that important lessons travel. They would talk about the man with the old toolbox, about the 4 minutes and 50 seconds, about the way he had stood beside a $2 million car and simply listened. And somewhere in that conversation, always someone would say, he wasn't showing off, he wasn't trying to prove anything, he just heard it. And that more than anything else was what Amelia Vaughn couldn't stop thinking about as she watched Ethan Cole's truck pull out of the parking lot and head toward the elementary school on Millbrook Road. She had built an empire on the belief that enough money could solve any problem. In 4 minutes and 50 seconds, a single father from a small-town garage had quietly, without drama, proven her wrong. And she wasn't done learning from him yet. The apology bothered her more than she expected. Not because she regretted saying it. She did regret the way she'd said it, hedged, indirect, wrapped in something polite, when what she actually meant was harder and more uncomfortable than I made you drive 40 minutes for a loose clamp. But what bothered her more was the fact that he had accepted it so easily. No performance of graciousness. No, oh, don't worry about it with the particular tone people use when they actually want you to worry about it quite a bit. Just that almost smile, and then he was gone, and the sound of his truck pulling out of the lot left a silence behind it that felt larger than it should have. She stood at the window of the performance center for longer than she meant to. Behind her, she could hear her team moving around. Garrett was doing something at the diagnostic station, pulling data, probably reconstructing the logic of what had just happened, in terms he could file a report about. The junior engineers were talking quietly. Nobody approached her. That was the thing about being the person at the top. The air around you changes. People sense the weather, and they adjust their behavior accordingly, and right now the weather in Amelia Vaughn's immediate vicinity was the kind that made sensible people find somewhere else to be. She turned around. Garrett. He looked up from the terminal. His expression was careful, controlled. The expression of a man who had been caught being wrong in front of everyone and was managing the emotional accounting of it with professional discipline. Yeah, he said. My office, 20 minutes. He nodded once. She walked out. She didn't go to her office immediately. She went to the small kitchen on the second floor, poured herself a coffee she didn't particularly want, and stood at the counter for a few minutes just thinking. The thing that kept returning to her wasn't the clamp. It wasn't even the 4 minutes and 50 seconds, though that number had lodged itself in her mind with the stubborn permanence of a fact that demands to be reckoned with. What kept returning was the moment when Ethan had stood beside the car with his eyes closed. She had seen diagnostic specialists work on vehicles her entire career. She had watched engineers run tests, pull data, cross-reference sensor outputs, build failure models. She had sat through presentations with charts and heat maps and confidence intervals. She understood all of it. She had built a company on it. She had never once seen anyone close their eyes. And the strange part, the part she couldn't quite organize into a clean thought, was that it hadn't looked like a technique. It hadn't looked like something he'd learned from a textbook or developed as a professional methodology. It had looked like the thing you do when you already know how to listen and you're simply doing it. She thought about what Diana had said. He learned from his father. He has his own shop on Millbrook Road. She thought about the toolbox, old metal, worn at the corners, the kind of object that has a history in it. She finished her coffee and went to her office. Garrett knocked and came in at almost exactly 20 minutes, which meant he had been standing in the hallway for probably 90 seconds, waiting for the time to be right. She noticed things like that. He sat down across from her desk. He had a tablet with him, which he placed on his knee, but didn't look at. "I want to understand what happened," she said. "The clamp. I know what happened mechanically, Garrett. I want to understand how 7 specialists missed it." He absorbed that. She watched him decide to be honest rather than strategic. "The intake system on that car is custom. There's no factory documentation for the lower junction assembly because it doesn't exist anywhere else. When we ran diagnostics, we were working from the build team's own schematics, and the clamp in question was..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "It was in a section of the system that our protocols don't flag as high risk. The sensors in that area are configured to watch for catastrophic failure, not microflex under specific load conditions. So the system was designed to look for the wrong things. The system was designed to look for the things we thought could go wrong." He set the tablet on her desk. "We weren't looking for something that subtle. There was no reason to think something that subtle could cause a detectable performance issue. And yet it did." "And yet it did," he said. Silence. "How did he know where to look?" she asked. Garrett considered this for a moment, and she had the sense that he had been sitting with this question for the last hour and hadn't arrived at an answer that fully satisfied him. "I asked him," Garrett said. "After you went upstairs. I asked him how he narrowed it down." "What did he say?" "He said the sound changed at 4200. Garrett shook his head slightly. "Not the engine note, he said the character of the sound changed. Like..." He paused, and she could see him trying to translate something that resisted translation. "Like the difference between a chord that's in tune and one where one string is barely off. You can't always point to the note, you just hear that something isn't right." Amelia was quiet for a moment. "Do we have anyone on staff who thinks that way?" she asked. Garrett opened his mouth, closed it. He was an honest man, which was primarily why she kept him. "No," he said finally. "Not like that. Our people are excellent at systematic analysis, at running the process, at interpreting what the instruments tell them." He set the tablet flat on the desk. "We don't really have anyone who listens." She nodded slowly. "Get me his contact information," she said. "I want to see him again." She called him herself. Not Diana, not her assistant, not her VP of anything. She called him from her personal phone the following morning at 7:30, which she immediately realized was possibly too early, but he answered on the second ring, sounding completely awake. "Cole?" "Ethan, it's Amelia Vaughn." A brief pause. "Morning. I'd like to take you to breakfast, if you have time." Another pause, that same quality of pause she'd noticed before, where she got the sense he was actually thinking about it, rather than performing thought. "I drop my daughter at school at 7:55, he said. "There's a diner on Route 9 called Patty's. I usually stop there after. You could meet me there around 8:15. She had a 7:30 meeting with her CFO, an 8 o'clock call with her European operations director, and a 9:30 that she couldn't move. 8:15, she said. "I'll be there." Patty's Diner was not the kind of place Amelia Vaughn typically had breakfast. It was small, slightly worn, with the specific comfortable shabbiness of a place that's been exactly what it is for a long time and isn't interested in being anything else. The kind of place where the coffee came in a thick ceramic mug without anyone asking, and the menu was laminated and hadn't changed significantly since the Clinton administration. Ethan was already at a table when she arrived. He had a coffee in front of him and was reading something on his phone, and he looked up when she came in and raised a hand in the uncomplicated way of a man who had found his table and was simply marking where he was. She sat down across from him. A woman who was presumably Patty, or someone who had inherited the authority of Patty, materialized and poured coffee without asking. Amelia accepted this. "Thank you for coming out here," Ethan said. "I should have offered to come to you yesterday," she said. "It would have been more appropriate." He shrugged. "You're the one with 40,000 square feet. Made sense to do it there." She smiled despite herself. She had prepared on the drive over a fairly organized set of things she wanted to discuss. The conversation she had in mind was a professional one, an offer structured and clear. She was good at structured and clear. But then she looked at him across the Formica table and said something she hadn't planned to say at all. "Tell me about your father." He looked up from his mug. "Where did that come from?" he asked. "Someone told me you learned from him, that he's the reason you work the way you do." She paused. "I want to understand what I'm actually dealing with, if that makes sense." He was quiet for a moment. She couldn't read it. She was usually very good at reading people's silences, at understanding what they were protecting or processing. But Ethan Cole's silences had a quality that was simply present. Not guarded, not calculating, just there, like he was actually taking the question seriously. "His name was Raymond," Ethan said. "He had a shop same building I'm in now. He bought it in 1987, and he worked it until he died. 31 years. He turned the mug in his hands. "He wasn't famous. He didn't train with anybody famous. He was the kind of guy who couldn't let a problem go. If something was wrong and he didn't know why it would keep him up at night, genuinely keep him up. He passed that to you. I think he passed the stubbornness to me," Ethan said, and that almost smile came back. "The rest I had to figure out." He looked down at the mug. He used to say, he said it so many times, it became kind of a family joke. He'd say the machine is always trying to tell you something. Your only job is to stop talking long enough to hear it. Amelia set her coffee down. She was quiet for a moment. "That's what you were doing," she said. "Yesterday, when you closed your eyes." "Yeah. You weren't running a diagnostic." "No. You were listening." "The car knew what was wrong," he said simply. "I just needed to get out of my own way long enough to hear it." She looked at him for a long moment. This man in his flannel shirt in a worn-out diner, who had done in 4 minutes and 50 seconds what $3 billion worth of corporate infrastructure had failed to do in 6 weeks, and who seemed entirely uninterested in the drama of that fact. "I want to make you an offer," she said. He leaned back slightly, waited. "I want you to work with my diagnostic division. Not as a consultant, I've had enough consultants. As a trainer. As someone who comes in, works with my team, and helps them understand how to do what you do." She paused. "I want my engineers to learn how to listen." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I have a shop," he said. "I know. It's not a fancy shop, but it's mine, and I have customers who depend on me. I'm not asking you to give it up. We can structure this, however makes sense, part-time, project-based, whatever works for your situation." She held his gaze. "I'm asking you to take what your father gave you and pass it to 40 people who genuinely need it." He was quiet again. "How old is your daughter?" she asked. She hadn't meant to ask that either. It kept happening with him. She kept saying the things that were actually on her mind, rather than the things she had prepared. 8, he said. "Mia. That's a beautiful name. She's a better person than me already," he said. "She gets that from her mother." He said it without visible pain, but with the particular careful flatness of a statement that has been handled many times and is kept behind glass now. "She died 3 years ago. Breast cancer." "I'm sorry," Amelia said. "Yeah." He looked at his coffee. "Me too." A beat passed between them that was quieter than the diner noise around them. "That's why the school pickup isn't negotiable," he said, "in case you were wondering." "I wasn't going to make it negotiable," she said. He looked at her. "I've got a 7-year-old niece," she said. "My sisters. She lost her father when she was 4. She didn't know why she was telling him this. I take her to the park on Sunday mornings. It's not negotiable for me either. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not enough that someone watching from across the diner would have noticed. But she noticed. What does the job actually look like? He asked. And she knew she had him. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. She was late to the call with her European operations director, which was something that had not happened in recent memory, and which caused a moderate disruption that her assistant handled with the competence Amelia paid her to have. She didn't particularly care. By the time she left Patty's diner, she had outlined the shape of an arrangement that made sense 3 days a week initially, with the flexibility for Ethan to keep Cole's auto running. His rate of pay was something she named first because she had learned long ago that the person who names the number first usually gets to control where it goes, and she named a number that was fair and then immediately revised it upward because something about the way he'd looked at the diner menu had made her think about what 3 days a week away from a small auto shop actually costs a man. He had argued with her about the number, which she found unexpectedly charming. "That's too much," he said. "It's what the position is worth." "The position doesn't have a name yet." "Director of Diagnostic Training," she said. "And yes, it is." He shook his head, but he didn't say no. On the drive back, her phone rang 3 times, and she ignored all 3 calls, which was something she almost never did. She was thinking about what he'd said about his father, about the machine always trying to tell you something, about the job of stopping talking long enough to hear it. She thought about her own father, a man who had sold insurance in suburban Connecticut, and who had believed with the particular passionate simplicity of a certain kind of father that his daughter could run anything she put her mind to. He had died 8 years ago. She had a photograph of him on her desk behind a discreet edge of a book where visitors wouldn't necessarily see it, but where she could. She thought about what it meant to pass something down. She thought about Raymond Cole, working in that shop on Millbrook Road for 31 years, teaching his son to close his eyes and listen. She thought about Mia Cole, 8 years old, waiting at the school gate every afternoon for her father's truck. By the time she pulled into the parking structure at Vaughn Motor Group, she had made another decision. She was good at that, the speed of decision, the clarity of it. But this one had a different quality than her usual decisions. It felt less like strategy and more like something she recognized but didn't have a clean word for. She went directly to HR. "I need you to set up a new position," she told them. "Director of Diagnostic Training. Get me the paperwork." She didn't tell Garrett until the following day. She called him into her office at 9 in the morning, and she could see when he sat down that he had been expecting this conversation, had been preparing for it, and was not entirely sure in which direction it was about to go. "I'm bringing Ethan Cole on," she said. Garrett's expression moved through 3 things quickly. Surprise, which he controlled. Something that might have been resentment, which he also controlled. And then underneath both of those, something more honest. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like relief. "In what capacity?" he asked. "He's going to work with your team, specifically on diagnostic methodology." She kept her voice matter of fact because she liked Garrett, and she wasn't trying to humiliate him. "I want your people to develop what he has, the observational skills, the ability to catch what the instruments miss." Garrett nodded slowly. "That's going to be..." He paused. "It's going to be a hard sell to some of them. They've got a lot of credentials between them." "I know. They're not going to love the idea that a guy from a neighborhood garage..." "Garrett." She stopped him, not unkindly. 4 minutes and 50 seconds. He closed his mouth. She leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking them to abandon what they know. I'm asking them to add to it." She held his gaze. "The instruments find what we program them to find. Ethan finds what's actually there. We need both." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "He reminds me of my grandfather," he said. "He was a machinist, old school, could put his hand on a running lathe and tell you something was off before the measurement ever showed it. He looked at the desk. I used to think that was just old man stuff. Something you did before the technology caught up. And now? He met her eyes. Now I'm thinking maybe we built the technology and forgot that the technology isn't the point. She looked at him for a moment. That's exactly right, she said. Don't forget that. Ethan Cole walked into Vaughn Motor Group for the second time on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the day with the clamp. He still carried the old metal toolbox. He still wore the flannel shirt. And when he walked into the diagnostic division's main workspace, 12 engineers looked up from their stations, and the room had the same texture it had the first day, that mixture of skepticism and reluctant curiosity. The quiet social mathematics of people calculating where this person ranked before he'd said a word. He set the toolbox down on a workbench. He looked at the room. My father told me something when I was about 12 years old, he said. He said, if you think you already know what's wrong, you'll find evidence for what you already think. If you want to find what's actually wrong, you have to be willing to not know. He paused. I know most of you are a lot more educated than I am. I know you have processes and tools and frameworks that I don't have. I'm not here to argue with any of that. He picked up a wrench from the toolbox. I'm here to teach you one thing: how to stop knowing long enough to hear the truth. The room was quiet. In the back, one of the senior engineers, a woman named Carolyn, who had 2 master's degrees and had been with the company for 9 years, raised her hand slightly. How do you teach someone to listen? She asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Ethan looked at her. The same way my father taught me, he said. You put them next to a running engine and you make them stand there until they stop thinking and start hearing. He glanced around the room. Who wants to go first? Nobody moved for a moment. Then Carolyn stood up. And that was how it began. Carolyn was the first. That mattered more than it seemed like it would at the time. She was not the youngest person in the room, and she was not the least experienced, and that was precisely why it mattered. When the person with 2 master's degrees and 9 years on staff stands up first, the room recalibrates. Not everyone, some people's calculus is more stubborn than that, but enough people shift enough of the silent social math gets reworked that the temperature of the space changes just slightly in the direction of possibility. Ethan acknowledged it with nothing more than a nod and led her over to the test bay, where a company vehicle was idling on the lift. It wasn't the supercar. It was a production model, a V8 performance sedan that had come in from their service division with a complaint from the owner about a roughness in the power delivery that their standard diagnostic pass had cleared as within spec. A car that was according to every instrument they had fine. Ethan had requested it specifically. Stand here, he said, positioning Carolyn about 4 feet from the front of the running engine. Not in front of the exhaust line, just here, and listen. She stood there, folded her arms, then unfolded them, then let them hang at her sides. She was a person who Amelia would have guessed was not accustomed to standing still and doing nothing, and the discomfort of it was visible in the small adjustments she kept making to her posture. What am I listening for? She asked after about 30 seconds. You'll know, he said. That's not really an answer. I know. He wasn't unkind about it. Listen anyway. She did, or she tried. She stood there for another minute and a half, and the room watched. Some of the engineers had drifted closer, maintaining the pretense of doing something else while clearly watching, and then she shook her head. I hear an engine, she said. It sounds fine to me. It does, Ethan agreed. Now close your eyes. She looked at him. I know, he said for the second time. Do it anyway. She closed her eyes. 15 seconds passed. 20. 30. And then Carolyn's head tilted. Just slightly. The same small movement Ethan had made in the performance center 3 weeks ago when Amelia had watched from the driver's seat and felt something she couldn't name. 45 seconds. Carolyn's eyes opened. "There's something in the top end," she said slowly. "It's not a knock, it's more like—" She trailed off, reaching for language. "Like a resonance that doesn't belong. It's very subtle. It's almost rhythmic." Ethan looked at her, and something in his face opened slightly, the expression of a teacher who has just watched someone understand something for the first time. "Yeah," he said. "There it is." From across the room, one of the other engineers, a younger man named Derek, who had been very quiet and very watchful since Ethan arrived, said, "Our instruments cleared that car." "I know," Ethan said. "So you're saying the instruments are wrong?" Ethan turned to look at Derek. He didn't respond immediately. He picked up a mechanic's stethoscope from the bench, pressed it against the valve cover, and listened for about 10 seconds. Then he handed it to Derek. "Tell me what you hear," he said. Derek held the stethoscope, looking slightly caught off guard by the directness of it. He listened, his brow furrowed. "There's a—" He listened again. "Is that a rocker arm?" "Valvetrain," Ethan said. "Slight wear on the third-cylinder rocker. Not enough to throw a code. Enough to eventually cause a problem." He took the stethoscope back. "The instruments aren't wrong. They're just not asking the right questions. Our job is to ask the ones they can't." Derek was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone who has been handed a thought that doesn't fit neatly into the drawers they already have and isn't quite sure what to do with it. But he didn't argue, and that was something. The first 2 weeks were harder than the second 2. That was the pattern Amelia watched develop from the edges, from the reports Garrett gave her, and from the couple of times she walked through the diagnostic bay herself. The people who were going to be resistant showed themselves early, and they were consistent about it. The same faces, the same body language, the same particular brand of skepticism that wasn't really about information at all, but about something more territorial. There were 3 of them who concerned her. Derek, who had softened slightly after the rocker arm incident, but who was still fundamentally unconvinced. A senior engineer named Paul, who was 52 years old and had been doing high-performance diagnostics for over 2 decades, and who had a way of asking questions that sounded like questions, but were actually challenges, the kind designed not to receive an answer, but to demonstrate that the person asking already knew the answer and found the exercise beneath them. And a man named Kevin, who was newer to the team and who had latched onto Paul's attitude with the specific loyalty of someone who hasn't yet formed his own and is borrowing someone else's in the meantime. Paul was the problem. Not because he was loud. He was rarely loud. It was subtler than that. It was the sighing, the micro-expressions, the way he would stand with his arms crossed and his weight on one leg, wearing the expression of a man enduring something he was too professional to object to openly. When Ethan spoke, Paul listened the way certain people listen, with enough of his attention to catch whatever he could use later, while spending the rest on maintaining the particular look of someone who is not impressed. 3 weeks in, he finally said it out loud. It happened in the middle of a session where Ethan was working through an exercise he called active listening mapping. Having the team build a picture of a running engine purely through auditory and tactile observation, without instruments, before running any diagnostic tools. The point was to develop what Ethan called a pre-diagnostic instinct, a sense of the machine's baseline before the data came in, so that the data had something to be measured against. Paul had been doing it technically. He was present. He was going through the motions. But he had the air of a man performing compliance rather than engaging in learning, and everyone in the room could feel the drag of it. Guys. Then Ethan made an observation about one of Paul's readings, a specific instance where Paul's tactile assessment had missed something that the subsequent instrument check had caught, and he said it plainly, without judgment. The way he said everything. You felt the vibration, but you categorized it before you finished feeling it. That's the habit we're trying to break. Paul turned to look at him. I've been doing this for 23 years, Paul said. 23 years, I've been identifying faults on high-performance vehicles. I've worked on race-prepped cars. I've worked on 6-figure restorations. I've worked on things that your shop would never see. He paused. And now I'm standing here doing what listening exercises because a small-town mechanic who fixed a loose clamp one time thinks my team needs to learn how to hear. The room went very still. Ethan didn't react immediately. He stood there for a moment with the specific quality of stillness that Amelia had noticed in him from the very first day, the stillness of someone who is not threatened, who is not calculating a counterattack, who is simply present and thinking about how to be useful. 23 years is a long time, Ethan said. Yes, Paul said. It is. Can I ask you something? Paul opened his hand slightly. Go ahead. In those 23 years, has there ever been a car that you ran a full diagnostic on? Everything came back clean, and you still had a feeling something wasn't right. A beat. Paul's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. That's not... Has there? Ethan asked. Calm, not pressing, just asking. The silence stretched. And in the silence something happened. Something private in Paul's face. A door opened briefly that he didn't mean to open, and behind it was something that the 23 years and the credentials and the crossed arms and the sighing had been stacked up in front of like sandbags against a flood. Once or twice, Paul said. His voice had changed slightly. Just slightly. The sharpness was still there, but underneath it was something else. What did you do? Ethan asked. I ran the diagnostic again. And, Paul looked at him, came back clean again, so I released the car. And, a pause. Longer. Customer came back 2 weeks later. Timing chain failure. Paul said it flatly. Not as confession, not as admission, just as data. But the flatness of it was its own kind of heaviness. It was in the instruments within range, but something was wearing. Something you felt, Ethan said. Paul didn't answer. Something you heard, Ethan said, before the data knew. The room was holding its breath. Paul looked at the floor, then back at Ethan, and his arms very slowly came uncrossed. I don't know how to teach myself to trust that, he said. And it was the most honest thing he had said since Ethan had walked through the door 3 weeks ago. That's the thing. I don't know how to trust something I can't quantify. I know, Ethan said. That's what we're here for. The timing chain story traveled through the team that same day. Amelia heard about it from Garrett at the end of the afternoon, told in the factual way Garrett reported things, but she heard the shape of what it meant, and she sat with it for a while after he left. She had built a career on quantification, on certainty, on the clean logic of data and the satisfying finality of a decision backed by evidence. She had an entire analytical infrastructure, human and technological, dedicated to the project of turning uncertainty into information. And she believed in that infrastructure. She still believed in it. But she was starting to understand something that she hadn't had a word for until now. I see. The infrastructure could only catch what the infrastructure was built to catch. Everything else required something older, something less tidy. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. It was 6:40 in the evening. He answered on the second ring. Hey. Background noise, what sounded like a kid's television program, and someone moving around a kitchen. Bad time, she asked. Mia's watching something loud. Hang on. A brief muffling, then. Sorry, go ahead. I heard what happened today, with Paul. Yeah. A pause. He's not a bad person. He's just protecting something. What is he protecting? Same thing everyone protects, Ethan said. The feeling that what he already knows is enough. A beat. It's scary to find out it isn't. Are you going to be able to reach him? I don't know, Ethan said, and she appreciated the honesty of it, the refusal to give her the answer that would have been easier to hear. People don't change because you want them to. They change because something in them is ready to. Another pause. Paul is almost there. He just needs a car. What does that mean? It means he needs to find something. With his hands and his ears and none of the equipment. and he needs to find it when it matters. Ethan's voice was matter-of-fact. When he does that, when the knowledge comes from inside him instead of from a screen, he'll trust it. You can't give that to someone. They have to experience it. She was quiet for a moment. In the background, she could hear a small voice say, "Daddy, the mac and cheese is bubbling," and Ethan's voice slightly away from the phone. "I'm coming. I've got it." "Go make dinner," Amelia said. "Yeah." A pause. "He'll come around. Give it another week." She believed him. She couldn't entirely explain why. The moment with Paul happened on a Thursday. The car came in on a Monday, a customer vehicle that had been flagged for an intermittent issue, and Garrett had put Paul on it specifically not by Ethan's instruction, but on Garrett's own judgment, which Amelia thought said something meaningful about how far Garrett had come in 3 weeks. Paul ran the diagnostics first. Comprehensive, systematic, thorough, everything the process called for. The car cleared on every parameter. He stood there looking at the results on the screen, with the expression of a man who has been given an answer that he doesn't quite believe. And he stood there for what Carolyn later described as a long time before he did what he did next. He walked away from the terminal. He walked to the car. He stood beside it. And he closed his eyes. Nobody made a sound. Later, Paul would describe what happened in a way that was characteristically unsentimental. He said, "It felt like the difference between reading about a place and standing in it. That the engine had a kind of voice that he had been hearing for 23 years and filtering through his expectations, and that for some reason that morning, with his eyes closed and the instruments behind him, he finally stopped filtering and just listened. He felt it in his chest before he processed it cognitively. A rhythm that was almost right, almost perfectly steady, but with a hesitation in it so small that it was less a sound than a texture, the difference between a heartbeat that's completely regular and one where one interval is 3 milliseconds too long." He opened his eyes. He walked to the diagnostic station and called up the fuel injection timing data. Not the summary, the raw output, millisecond by millisecond. He looked at it for about 30 seconds. Then he walked to Ethan's workbench. "Injection timing," Paul said. "Cylinder 2. It's within spec by 0.5%, but the pattern is irregular. It's not a steady variance, it's intermittent. The injector is starting to foul." Ethan looked at him. "How'd you find it?" he asked. Paul held his gaze. "I listened," he said. Something passed between them, not sentimental, not dramatic. Just real. The recognition between two people who speak the same language, even if one of them learned it later than the other. "Good," Ethan said, and went back to what he was doing. Paul stood there for another moment. Then he went back to the car, pulled the cylinder 2 injector, and confirmed the fouling under magnification. Carolyn saw it happen and said nothing, but she found Ethan at the end of the day. "Paul just became your best student," she told him. "He was always good," Ethan said. "He just had to get out of his own way." Amelia heard about the injector on Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, she was in the diagnostic bay herself, not to observe, not to manage, just because she wanted to see what the room felt like now. It felt different. She couldn't have written a report about what was different. The equipment was the same. The people were the same people. But the quality of attention in the room had changed. The way they moved around the vehicles had changed. There was less of the brisk process-driven efficiency she had always seen there before, and more of something slower, more deliberate, more patient. She watched Paul at a workbench running an active listening exercise on his own, voluntarily, not because Ethan had assigned it. He had his eyes closed and his hand flat against the valve cover of a running engine, and his face had the specific focused quietness of a man who is paying attention to something real. She watched Carolyn working with Derek, guiding him through the same exercise she had been guided through on that first day. "Close your eyes." "I know. Do it anyway." She watched Kevin, who had arrived as Paul's shadow, and was now tentatively becoming something more individual, standing at a respectful distance from Ethan, watching him work through a diagnosis and asking questions that were genuinely curious, rather than performatively skeptical. Yeah. And she watched Ethan himself, moving through the room, with that particular unhurried quality he carried everywhere, stopping here to ask a question, there to make an observation, never raising his voice, never performing authority, just present, just useful, just doing what his father had taught him to do in a small shop on Millbrook Road 3 decades ago. She stood there for about 10 minutes before he noticed her. He walked over. "You're hovering," he said, not unkindly. "I know." She looked around the room. "It's different in here." "Yeah." "What changed?" He thought about it for a second. "They stopped being afraid of not knowing," he said. "That was the main thing. Most people, and I was this way too for a long time, most people treat not knowing as a failure, so they rush to an answer. Any answer, as long as it's an answer." He glanced back at the room. "But not knowing is just the beginning of finding out. The machines aren't wrong when they don't catch something. They're just not finished yet. And neither are we." Amelia looked at him. "Your father said that too?" she asked. "No," Ethan said. "That one I figured out myself." She nodded slowly. She thought about 6 weeks. About 43 specialists. About a 40-page report that had concluded the problem might be perceptual. She thought about 4 minutes and 50 seconds. "Ethan?" "Yeah. There are people at this company, not in this room, who have been making decisions about what's fixable and what isn't for a long time." She paused, choosing words carefully. "I want to expand this. What you're doing here, the methodology, the philosophy, I want it in more divisions, not just diagnostics." He looked at her with that measured expression she had come to know. "That's a bigger conversation," he said. "I know. I've still got a shop." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My daughter has a school play on Friday, the afternoon session." "I'll make sure you're there," she said. And this time when he looked at her, there was no almost about the smile. The school play was a production of Charlotte's Web. Mia Cole played Wilbur the Pig. Whoa. She had insisted on this role specifically, Ethan had told Amelia in passing one afternoon. Because, and this was a direct quote from an 8-year-old, Wilbur is the one everybody underestimates, and then he turns out to matter the most. Ethan had said it with that flat delivery of his, the one that kept emotion at arm's length, while somehow conveying it completely, and Amelia had nodded and said nothing, and thought about it for the rest of the day. She had not planned to attend the play. She had mentioned it to Diana on Thursday afternoon. Mentioned it the way you mention something you're thinking about, but haven't committed to wrapped in professional language. "Ethan's daughter has a performance, Friday. I want to make sure the afternoon schedule is clear for him." Diana had said, "Of course," and then paused in the doorway and said, "Are you going?" And Amelia had said, "That would be unusual," and Diana had said yes, and left it there with the diplomatic precision of someone who knows exactly how much to say. Amelia went. She sat in the back row of the school auditorium on a metal folding chair, surrounded by parents she didn't know, holding a program that had been photocopied slightly off-center. And she watched a small girl in a pink pig costume stand in the center of a hand-painted barn backdrop and deliver her lines with the total commitment of a child who is not yet afraid of being seen. Ethan was 4 rows ahead of her. She had spotted him when she came in, the back of his head, the flannel shirt, the particular upright quality of his posture that was different from when he was working, more careful, somehow more conscious. He had a phone out and was filming. At the end, when Mia took her bow and looked out into the audience with that bright, unself-conscious joy that children have when they have done something, and know it was good, her eyes found her father immediately, the way a compass finds north. And Ethan raised his hand, the same uncomplicated gesture he'd used to greet Amelia at Patty's diner, and Mia beamed so wide it was visible from the back row. Duh. Amelia felt something move in her chest. She couldn't have named it precisely. It wasn't envy exactly. It was more like recognition. The recognition of something she had been working around for a long time, without fully acknowledging what she was working around. She left before the parents gathered in the hallway afterward. She didn't want to intrude on whatever small important world existed in the space between the end of a school play and the drive home. But in the car, she sat for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about what Ethan had said. Wilbur is the one everybody underestimates, and then he turns out to matter the most. 8 years old, and she already knew. The expansion conversation happened the following Monday. Amelia had pulled together a small group herself. Garrett, her VP of Operations, named Sandra Chen, and her head of product development. A man named Frank Alcott, who had been with the company for 14 years, and who had the specific quality of someone who had been right about enough things over a long enough time that he had stopped being particularly interested in being wrong. He was polite about it, but the disinterest was there. Ethan sat across from all of them at the conference table with his coffee and his characteristic stillness, and Amelia watched the room read him the way rooms always read him. The clothes, the toolbox he'd brought out of habit and left near the door. The absence of a laptop or a prepared presentation, and she watched them calculate. She had stopped finding it surprising. She had started finding it instructive. "I want to talk about what's been happening in diagnostics," she said, "and whether it applies more broadly." She looked at Sandra. "Sandra, you've seen the numbers from the last 6 weeks." Sandra opened her folder. Customer satisfaction in the service division is up 11%. Repeat fault rates, cars coming back with the same issue, are down 18%. She paused. "Those are significant numbers for a 6-week period." Frank looked at Ethan. "What exactly are you teaching them?" "How to listen," Ethan said. Frank's expression was patient. "Can you be more specific?" "Sure." Ethan set his coffee down. "Your diagnostic team has excellent tools and excellent training in how to use those tools. What they didn't have is the habit of using their own perception before they let the tools do the perceiving for them. We've been working on building that habit. Standing next to a running engine and paying attention to what their senses tell them before they look at a single screen. And that's producing an 18% drop in repeat faults," Frank said. He said it not skeptically, but with the specific curiosity of an engineer evaluating a mechanism. "The instruments catch what they're programmed to catch," Ethan said. "Human perception catches the context, the pattern, the thing that's slightly off in a way that doesn't fit any existing category." He looked at Frank directly. "Your instruments are excellent, but they're asking the questions you already thought to ask. The problems you haven't thought to ask about yet, those require a different approach." Frank was quiet for a moment. "What you're describing," he said slowly, "sounds like what we used to call master craftsman intuition. The knowledge that comes from years of hands-on experience that can't be fully articulated." "Yeah," Ethan said. "That's exactly what it is. The conventional wisdom is that you can't teach intuition." "The conventional wisdom is wrong," Ethan said. "You can't teach someone else's intuition, but you can create conditions where a person develops their own. That's what experience is. We've just been trying to shortcut the experience with data, and data is a shortcut that works right up until the moment it doesn't." Sandra looked at Amelia. "Where do you want to expand this?" Amelia leaned forward. "Product development, quality assurance, and customer relations." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Customer relations?" "The same principle applies," she said. "We have people who talk to customers and process their feedback through our existing categories. Our satisfaction surveys, our complaint frameworks, our service protocols. But how much of what a customer is actually trying to tell us gets lost because we're listening for the things we already know to listen for?" The room was quiet. She had been thinking about this for 2 weeks. It had started as a thought about diagnostics, and then it had kept going. The way a stone thrown into still water keeps producing rings outward from the center. And by the time she sat down in this conference room, she understood that what Ethan had walked into her building carrying in an old metal toolbox was not a diagnostic technique. It was a philosophy, a way of being in relationship with the unknown. And it applied everywhere. Whoa. Frank pushed back. Not aggressively, that wasn't his style, but persistently with the methodical quality of someone who needs to test a thing thoroughly before he can commit to it. His concern was standardization. How do you scale something that's fundamentally personal, he asked. How do you measure whether someone has developed perceptual sensitivity versus whether they think they have? He asked the questions Amelia expected him to ask, and she didn't dismiss them because they were real questions with real implications for how a company of this size implemented anything. Ethan listened to all of it. He didn't rush to answer. When Frank finished, Ethan said, "You're right that it's hard to scale. But here's the thing. You've already scaled things that are fundamentally personal. Customer trust is fundamentally personal. Brand loyalty is fundamentally personal. Quality at the level your company operates at is fundamentally personal. You scale those things by hiring people who have the capacity for them and then building systems that support rather than replace that capacity." He paused. This is the same thing. You find the people who already have some of this instinct, and in any group of 20 people, a few of them do, and you give them permission to use it. Then you build a culture where that kind of attention is valued, instead of just the measurable outputs. And Frank looked at him for a long moment. "You've thought about this more than I expected," he said. It wasn't an insult. It was an honest observation. "I've been thinking about it my whole life," Ethan said. "I just didn't know how to describe it until recently." "What changed?" Frank asked. Ethan glanced at Amelia. "I got asked better questions," he said. Sandra brought it to implementation. That was her strength, taking a direction and building the architecture for it, and she did it with the efficient practicality that had made her indispensable for 11 years. Yet, she and Ethan spent 3 afternoons the following week mapping what a broader program would look like. Amelia heard about these sessions from Sandra rather than from Ethan. He didn't report back, which she had noticed before, and which she had come to understand was not evasiveness, but simply the quality of a man who was focused on doing the thing rather than on being observed doing it. Sandra's reports were enthusiastic in her characteristically understated way. "He asks very good questions," she told Amelia. "He doesn't accept the first version of anything. He keeps asking why until he gets to the thing that actually matters." Amelia recognized this. She did the same thing. It was, she had started to think, not a coincidence that they worked well together. The program they designed was called at Ethan's suggestion, with characteristic simplicity, the Listening Initiative. It would run across 4 divisions. It would involve mandatory sessions for all technical staff and optional sessions for non-technical staff. Because Ethan had said firmly that you couldn't force this on people, that voluntary participation was itself a kind of self-selection for the people who were already capable of it and ready to do the work. He had also said something else that Sandra repeated verbatim because she had written it down. Any training program that makes people feel stupid for not knowing something will fail. The only training that works is the kind that makes people feel capable of knowing more than they thought they could. Amelia had that put on the program documentation. The industry noticed before the quarter ended. It started with a piece in a trade publication, a short item in Automotive Executive about Vaughan Motor Group's service satisfaction numbers, which were by that point tracking at their highest level in the company's history. The piece was factual and unremarkable, the kind of brief industry note that most people skim and forget. But someone at a competing group, a large conglomerate with 4 brands under its umbrella, read it and made a call to someone at Vaughan, and that call found its way to Amelia's desk within 24 hours. The call was from a man named Harrison Webb. He was the COO of Meridian Automotive Group, which was, depending on how you counted, either Vaughan's largest competitor or its second largest. And he and Amelia had a relationship that was cordial in the specific way that relationships between competitors are cordial, built on mutual respect and mutual watchfulness, neither of which ever fully relaxed in the other's presence. "Your service numbers are interesting," he said when she called him back. "Thank you. What are you doing differently?" She considered how to answer this. "We've made some changes to our diagnostic methodology," she said. 11% satisfaction improvement in 6 weeks is not a methodology tweak, he said. That's a culture shift. She was quiet for a moment. "Harrison," she said. "Are you asking me to share proprietary information?" "I'm asking you what's happening over there that I should know about," he said. "As someone who has competed with you for 17 years and respected you for most of them." She thought about what Ethan had said in the conference room. You find the people who already have some of this instinct, and you give them permission to use it. She made a decision. "I'll tell you exactly what's happening," she said. "I hired a mechanic from a small town who carries an old metal toolbox, and he is teaching my engineers how to listen." She paused. "That's it. That's the whole thing." A silence. "That's not a joke, is it?" Harrison said. "I don't make jokes about quarterly numbers." Another silence. "Can I meet him?" She told Ethan about the call that afternoon. He was in the diagnostic bay working through a session with 3 of the newer members of the team, and he looked up when she walked in and read something in her face. Immediately, she had noticed before that he was very good at this, at picking up what people were carrying before they said what it was. "What happened?" he said. She told him about Harrison Webb. He listened. He didn't react the way she half expected, didn't straighten up, or look calculating, or show any sign of the particular excitement that most people showed when told that a major figure in their industry wanted to meet them. He said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to let him meet you," she said. "But I want it to be on your terms." He looked at her. "My terms. You work for me. But what you know belongs to you. I'm not going to hand you over to a competitor as a resource without your full understanding of what that means." She paused. "I want you to have legal representation before any meeting happens. I want there to be an agreement in place about what is and isn't shareable." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't have a lawyer," he said. "I know. My firm will arrange someone for you, independent of my firm, someone whose job is specifically to represent your interests." He looked at her steadily. "Why are you doing that?" "Because it's right," she said. He studied her face. "You've changed," he said. Not as a compliment, not as an observation he was testing, just as a fact stated plainly, the way he stated everything. She hadn't expected that. "How?" she asked. "You came to Patty's Diner ready to make an offer," he said. "The whole conversation you knew what you wanted, and you were steering toward it. Which is fair, that's how you operate. But you still stopped when I talked about Mia. You actually stopped." He picked up a wrench, turned it in his hands. "You're not doing that less. You're doing it more." She didn't have an immediate answer for that. She didn't. "My father would have liked you," she said finally. "He was a big believer in the idea that the smartest thing a person can do is admit what they don't know yet." Ethan nodded. "My father would have said the same thing about yours." The meeting with Harrison Webb happened 3 weeks later on neutral ground, a conference facility not associated with either company, which had been Ethan's condition, conveyed through the attorney Amelia's firm had arranged for him. Harrison was 61 years old and had the bearing of a man who had operated at a high level for long enough that it had become his natural posture, not arrogant exactly, but accustomed. He was used to being the most experienced person in the room. He was used to the room knowing it. "But what?" He shook Ethan's hand, and Amelia watched him do what she had done in her own performance center months ago. The quick read the calibration, the flicker of something that he was professional enough to immediately suppress. She recognized it because she had done it. She recognized the suppression because she had done that too. They sat down. Harrison said, "I want to understand what you're doing and whether there's a version of it that makes sense for my teams." Ethan said, "Tell me about a problem your teams can't solve." Harrison blinked. It was barely visible, the blink of a man who was used to asking the questions rather than being handed one before the meeting had properly started. "That's an unusual way to begin," he said. "It's the most direct way," Ethan said. "I don't know your organization. You do. If you tell me a real problem, I can tell you whether what I do is relevant to it. If we just talk theory, we'll be here all afternoon and you'll go home with a philosophy instead of an answer." Harrison looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened his folder and put a data sheet on the table. "We have a recurring fault pattern in our V8 platform," he said. 4 models, 3 years intermittent power loss, under certain load conditions. Our diagnostic teams have run full analysis 18 times. We've replaced components, updated software, changed protocols. The fault recurs." He paused. "Our warranty costs on this issue are approaching $9 million. Ethan looked at the sheet. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it the way he had looked at Amelia's car on that first day, with a stillness that was actually a form of intense attention. "What do your customers say it feels like?" he asked. Harrison looked slightly caught. "What do you mean?" "The drivers. When the fault happens, what do they describe feeling?" Harrison looked at his folder. "We have the complaint data. Most of them describe a momentary loss of response under, not the complaint categorizations," Ethan said. "The actual words, what do they say?" Harrison looked at Amelia. She kept her expression neutral, but she was smiling on the inside. Harrison turned back to his folder and shuffled to a section near the back. He had the raw complaint data, the actual customer language, not the cleaned-up categories that the service system had processed it into. He read several of them aloud, and Ethan Cole sat there listening, his eyes slightly unfocused, his head tilted by just a degree or two. The same posture, the same quality of attention that he had brought to a running engine in a 40,000 square foot facility months ago, and that had not changed in any essential way since a man named Raymond Cole had first taught him to use it in a small repair shop on Millbrook Road. When Harrison finished, Ethan said, "The customers keep using the word hesitation, not stall, not surge, hesitation, like the engine is thinking about whether to comply." He looked at Harrison. "That's a different thing than what your diagnostics are looking for. That's not a component fault. That's a communication fault. Something in the relationship between the driver input and the powertrain response." Harrison was very still. "You got that from reading customer complaints," he said. "I got that from listening to what your customers were actually saying," Ethan said. "There's a difference." The meeting ran 2.5 hours. When it ended, Harrison Webb shook Ethan's hand again. And this time, there was no flicker. Or if there was, it was a different kind. The kind that comes not from underestimation, but from recognition. In the hallway afterward, he pulled Amelia aside. "Where did you find him?" he asked. "A small shop on Millbrook Road," she said. "Someone recommended him. I almost didn't call." Harrison looked at her. "What changed your mind?" She thought about Diana in the doorway. "I have a name." She thought about the 40-page report. She thought about 6 weeks and the particular weight of a problem that wouldn't resolve. "I ran out of other options," she said. "And then I listened." Harrison nodded slowly. "That's a harder thing than it sounds," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Ethan left the meeting at 2:40 in the afternoon. He had a school pickup at 3:15. Amelia walked him to the parking lot and stood beside his truck while he put the toolbox in the back. The old metal toolbox worn at the corners. The one that had been his father's before it was his. "How do you think that went?" she asked. "Good," he said, not elaborating. "He's going to want to bring you in." "Probably. How do you feel about that?" He looked at her across the truck bed. "I feel like I need to pick up my daughter," he said. "And then I need to think about it." He closed the tailgate. "And then I'll probably call you." "Okay," she said. He got in the truck. She stood there for a moment after he pulled away in the particular quiet that his departures seemed to leave behind a quality she had noticed since the very first day when his truck had pulled out of the Vaughn Motor Group parking lot, and she had stood at the window thinking about what it cost her to almost turn him away. She thought about Raymond Cole, about 31 years in a shop on Millbrook Road, about the knowledge that passes between a father and a son over decades of working beside each other, knowledge that can't be written in a report or captured in a data set that lives only in the hands, in the ears, in the chest, in the particular kind of attention that costs something to maintain. She thought about her own father. She thought about Sunday mornings at the park with her niece. She thought about the things that get passed down and the price of ignoring them, and the strange grace of a moment when someone forces you to stop and pay attention to what you've been too busy to hear. Her phone rang. It was Sandra. She let it ring twice before answering, which was unusual for her. "What have you got?" she said. "The Q3 service numbers just came in." Sandra's voice had the quality it got when the data was doing something she hadn't predicted. "Amelia, we're at 22% improvement in repeat fault rates. The listening initiative is outperforming every projection we built." Amelia looked at the empty parking lot. "Put together a full report," she said. "I want it on my desk by Thursday." "Already started," Sandra said. She hung up. She stood there a moment longer. 22%. 4 minutes and 50 seconds. A loose clamp. An old metal toolbox. And a man who had learned from his father that the machine is always trying to tell you something and that your only job is to stop talking long enough to hear it. She walked back inside. She had work to do. The Thursday report landed on Amelia's desk at 8:14 in the morning, which meant Sandra had been working on it since before dawn, which was not unusual for Sandra, but was the kind of thing Amelia noticed and filed away in the category of things she owed people recognition for. She read it twice before her first meeting. 22% reduction in repeat fault rates. 11% improvement in overall customer satisfaction. Average diagnostic resolution time down by a third. Warranty claim costs in the divisions running the listening initiative down by nearly a quarter in the first full quarter of implementation. And at the bottom of the report, in Sandra's characteristically understated way, a single line that carried more weight than everything above it: employee engagement scores in participating divisions are the highest recorded in company history. Amelia set the report down. She looked at the photograph on her desk, her father half hidden behind the edge of a book, the way she had always kept it visible to her and not to visitors. He was laughing at something in the photograph. She didn't remember what. He had been a man who laughed easily, which was something she had always considered separate from her own character, a trait she had inherited in theory, but not in practice until recently, she thought. Until something had shifted in the last few months, in a way she was still mapping. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. He answered on the third ring. She could hear the shop in the background, the particular acoustic of a garage, metal and concrete, and the distant sound of something mechanical. "You're at the shop," she said. "Tuesday's my heavy day," he said. "What's up?" "I got Sandra's report." "Good numbers. Very good numbers." She paused. "I want to do something with them. Not just internally, publicly. I want to tell this story. The real story, not a press release version. I want people in this industry to understand what happened here and why it worked." A brief silence. "What does that look like?" he asked. "An industry conference. There's one in Detroit in February, the largest automotive leadership summit in the country. They've asked me to keynote 3 times, and I've turned them down every time, because I never had anything worth saying that I hadn't already said." She paused. "I want to do it this year, and I want you there." The silence on his end was longer this time. She heard something being set down in the background. The ambient noise of the shop shifted. He'd moved somewhere quieter. "You want me to speak at an automotive leadership summit?" he said. "I want you to be there." Whether you speak is your decision. But yes, I think you should speak. Amelia. His voice had a quality she recognized, the careful flatness he used when he was about to say something he'd thought about. I'm a mechanic. I run a shop with 2 bays and 1 part-time employee. The people at that conference have been in boardrooms longer than I've been in business. I know. They're not going to want to hear from me. I thought that once, she said. I was wrong. A pause. That's not the same thing, he said. Isn't it? She kept her voice even. You walked into my facility and every person in that room made the same calculation I made. And then you fixed in 5 minutes what 7 specialists couldn't fix in 6 weeks. The math is the same, Ethan. The room is bigger. The math is the same. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might push back again. Then, what would I even say? Tell them what your father told you, she said. The rest follows from that. She didn't push him for an answer that day. She had learned it had taken her a few months, but she had learned that Ethan Cole did not make decisions faster because you pushed. He made them in the time it took him to make them, and pushing only made the silence on his end more patient, which she found genuinely difficult to outlast. She gave him a week. In that week, other things happened. Harrison Webb's team had been working on the hesitation fault in the V8 platform since the meeting 3 weeks prior. They had taken Ethan's observation, that's not a component fault, that's a communication fault, and begun working backward from the customer language rather than forward from the diagnostic data. It was a methodological inversion that their engineers had reportedly found initially disorienting and then gradually clarifying. They found the fault on a Thursday afternoon. Monday. It was a calibration conflict between the throttle position sensor software and the transmission control module, a conflict that only manifested under very specific load conditions in a band so narrow that standard diagnostic cycles never triggered it. The kind of thing that looked from the instrument side like everything was working. The kind of thing that felt from the driver side like the machine was thinking about whether to comply. Hesitation. Harrison called Amelia himself. He said 7 words before she could say anything. He was right about all of it. She said, I know. He said, $9 million in warranty costs, and the answer was in the customer complaints the whole time. She said, it usually is. A pause. How do I get more of this into my organization? He asked. Hire people who listen, she said, and then get out of their way. Ethan called her back on a Friday evening, 8 days after she'd asked him. She was at home, which was unusual for a Friday. She had left the office at 6 for the first time in recent memory, driven by some impulse she hadn't entirely examined. She was sitting in the kitchen with a glass of wine and a book she hadn't opened when the phone rang. Okay, he said. She set down the wine. Okay. I'll do it. The conference. A pause. But I'm not doing a PowerPoint presentation. I wouldn't ask you to. And I'm not wearing a suit. I also wouldn't ask you to. And if they ask questions that are stupid, I'm going to answer them honestly. Ethan, she said, that's the only way I've ever seen you answer any question. A brief silence. Then from his end, something she hadn't heard before, an actual laugh. Not the almost smile. A real one, short and genuine, and slightly surprised at itself. How long do I have to talk? He asked. As long as it takes, she said. That's not a time. 45 minutes. We'll do a conversation format, you and me on stage. I'll ask questions, you answer them. We'll take a few from the room at the end. A conversation, he said. I can do that. I know you can. Another pause. Mia's going to think this is hilarious, he said. Tell her Wilbur would approve, Amelia said. This time the silence had warmth in it. Yeah, he said. She will. February in Detroit was exactly what February in Detroit always was. Cold in the specific bone-deep way of a city built on a river gray, in the particular flat way of a sky that has been overcast since November and shows no interest in changing. The convention center was warm and full, and carried the specific energy of an industry that was simultaneously confident and anxious, aware that it was navigating more change than it had seen in decades, and not entirely sure which of its old certainties still applied. Amelia had keynoted conferences before. She was comfortable on stage, not in the way of people who love being watched, but in the way of people who have something to say and have stopped being afraid of the room between them and the person they're saying it to. This one was different. She felt it when she walked out. A different quality of attention, or maybe it was her own attention that was different. The way she was listening to the room rather than performing for it. Ethan walked out with her. He carried the toolbox. She had expected someone, maybe Diana, maybe Sandra, maybe one of the conference organizers who had been very professionally anxious about the format of this session, to say something about the toolbox. No one did. Or, if they started to something about his manner of carrying it, the absolute naturalness of it made the words unnecessary before they were spoken. The auditorium held 1,100 people. She had spoken to larger rooms. This felt larger. She introduced him simply. No long biography, no list of credentials, no industry context. Just, this is Ethan Cole. He runs a 2-bay shop on Millbrook Road in a small town 40 minutes from our headquarters. He fixed a problem in 5 minutes that 7 specialists couldn't fix in 6 weeks. And then he changed the way we think about everything. She sat down across from him, the way they'd sat across from each other at Patty's Diner 10 months ago, and she said, "Tell them what your father told you." Ethan looked out at 1,100 people. He didn't pause to adjust to them. He didn't perform the specific self-consciousness of a man who is not used to being on stage. He just looked at them the way he looked at everything, with that steady, patient attention that she had come to understand was not a technique, but a character, not something he did, but something he was. "My father was a mechanic," he said. "He had a shop for 31 years. He wasn't famous. He never worked on a race car. He fixed the cars of people who lived in his town. People who needed their car to get to work, to pick up their kids to get to the hospital. Ordinary cars with ordinary problems, fixed for ordinary people." He paused. "He used to say the machine is always trying to tell you something. Your only job is to stop talking long enough to hear it." The room was very quiet. "I've been in your world for about 10 months now," he said. "I've worked with engineers who have more education in their left hand than I've got in my whole career. I've sat in rooms with technology that I couldn't have imagined when I was learning this trade in my father's shop. And what I've learned, what keeps being true no matter how sophisticated the room gets, is that the machine is still talking. And we're still not always listening." Someone in the front row shifted. Not from discomfort from the particular physical attention of a person who is leaning in. "The instruments you have are extraordinary," he said. "I'm not here to argue against the instruments. I'm here to tell you that the instruments can only answer the questions you know to ask. The things that go wrong in ways you haven't anticipated yet. The new failures, the edge cases, the 1 in a million fault that shows up in a customer complaint written in plain English, those are asking to be heard. And right now, in most of your organizations, nobody is listening for them, because nobody gave them permission to slow down long enough to hear." He reached into the toolbox. He took out a wrench. Not to use, just to hold the way a person holds something familiar when they're talking about something important. The same way a speaker might hold a pen or a professor might hold a piece of chalk. "My father gave me this," he said. "He used it for 30 years before he gave it to me. I've used it since." He turned it in his hands. "It doesn't have any data in it. It can't run a diagnostic. It can't generate a report. What it can do is the one thing that everything else requires. First, it can be in direct contact with the thing that needs to be understood. Touching it, feeling it, listening to it." He looked up. "That's not romantic," That's not nostalgia for an older way of doing things. That's the first step in a process that your instruments then make more precise. But if you skip the first step, if you go straight to the data, you're only finding what you already know how to look for. He set the wrench down on the table between them. The most expensive fault I ever heard about cost a company $9 million over 3 years, he said. The answer was in the customer complaints the whole time, written in plain language by ordinary people who were trying to describe something their car was doing. The word they kept using was hesitation. Not a technical term, just hesitation, like the engine was thinking about whether to comply. He paused. Nobody read those complaints and heard what they were saying, because the people whose job it was to listen were too busy looking at screens. 1,100 people in the room. Not one of them moved. I'm not telling you to throw away the screens, he said. I'm telling you to read the complaints first. The questions from the room ran 30 minutes over the scheduled time. The conference organizers, to their credit, let it run. The questions were good. They were the questions of people who were genuinely thinking, rather than performing people who had heard something that didn't fit their existing categories and were working out what to do with it. An engineering VP from a German brand asked about methodology. A quality assurance director from a domestic manufacturer asked about implementation. A young woman near the back, she looked like she might have been an intern, or possibly a student who had managed to get a seat, raised her hand and asked very directly, "How do you teach someone to trust what they feel when the data says something different?" Ethan looked at her. "You find them a car that the data has cleared," he said, "and you put them next to it, and you make them stand there until they stop thinking about the data and start hearing the car. And when they find something, when they feel something, the instruments missed, you follow up on it, you confirm it, you let them see that they were right." He paused. People don't trust their own perception when they've been trained not to. You rebuild that trust by giving them experiences where the perception turns out to be correct. You do that enough times and they start to believe it. And when they believe it, when they trust what they actually know, they become better at their job than any instrument alone could make them. The young woman wrote something down. Amelia watched from the seat beside him. She thought about Paul standing beside a running engine with his eyes closed. She thought about Carolyn, whose hand had tilted by just a degree, who had heard something in a running engine that 12 instruments had missed. She thought about Garrett, who had said quietly, "Maybe we built the technology and forgot that the technology isn't the point." She thought about herself at 5:45 in the morning, reading an email from Garrett that suggested her perception of her own car might be perceptual rather than mechanical. She thought about the particular cold anger of being told that what she knew she was experiencing wasn't real. She thought about what it had cost her in pride and certainty, in the specific and uncomfortable currency of being wrong about the right thing, to finally stop reaching for another specialist, and reach instead for a name she'd never heard written on a notepad by a woman who simply said, "I have a name." She thought about Diana in the doorway. She thought about Patty's Diner and thick ceramic mugs and a conversation that started as an offer and became something else entirely. She thought about a small girl in a pink pig costume who already knew at 8 years old that the one everybody underestimates is the one who turns out to matter most. Afterward in the hallway, people came to find Ethan, not in the aggressive business card pressing way of conference networking, in the quieter way of people who have something they genuinely want to say and aren't sure how to say it. An older engineer who had been in the industry for 40 years and who shook Ethan's hand and said simply, "My father was a machinist. He would have said everything you said." A woman who ran quality assurance for a truck manufacturer and who asked without preamble, "Can I call you?" And Ethan said yes and gave her the shop number, which was the only number he gave, and she looked at the number he'd written on the back of a paper program, and then looked at him with an expression that was part amusement and part something more genuine. "Cole's Auto," she said. "That's it," he said. "On Millbrook Road." 40 minutes from anywhere, he said. "But we'll figure it out." Amelia stood at a slight distance and let it happen. She was good at this, at making space when space was what was needed, at knowing which moments were not hers. She had spent a career learning when to fill a room and when to let the room fill itself. And this was the second kind. And Garrett was there. He had driven up from the company headquarters, and he stood slightly apart from the crowd around Ethan with a cup of coffee, and the expression of a man who is watching something that is asking him to revise something about himself. When Amelia came to stand beside him, he looked at her. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "What?" "The clamp." He shook his head slowly. 6 weeks. The whole diagnostic infrastructure of this company brought to bear on one car. And it was a half-turn on a clamp in a section of the intake system we weren't configured to check. He paused. Not because we lacked the tools, because we lacked the instinct to look there. "And now?" she asked. "And now I'm watching the guy who looked there explaining to 1,100 engineers how to look the way he looks." He glanced at her. "I think that's worth more than we're paying him." "I gave him a raise last month," she said. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "He argued about it," she said. Garrett almost smiled. "Yeah, he would." They drove back separately. Garrett to the airport. Amelia and Ethan both back toward home in different directions, their routes diverging at the edge of the city. In the parking structure before he got into his truck, Ethan put the toolbox in the back and stood for a moment with his hand on the tailgate. Not doing anything. Just standing there the way he sometimes stood beside machines. Like he was paying attention to something that didn't have a sound yet. "How do you think it went?" Amelia asked. He looked at her. "You asked me that after the Harrison Webb meeting," he said. "I'm asking again." He was quiet for a moment. "I think some of them heard it," he said. "Not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but some." He looked at the toolbox in the back of the truck. "That's how it works, right? You say the thing to enough people. The ones who are ready to hear it, hear it. The ones who aren't, maybe they hear it later. Maybe they remember it when they're standing beside a car that the instruments have cleared and something tells them to stay a little longer." "Your father," she said. "Yeah." He closed the tailgate. "He said something like that once. He said you don't plant a seed and then stand there watching it grow. You plant it and you walk away and you trust the ground." She looked at him. "Did he know he was teaching you things that would last this long?" she asked. Ethan thought about it. "I think he was just trying to teach me how to fix cars," he said. "The rest of it I don't know. Maybe he knew. Maybe that's just what happens when someone pays attention to the work. The work carries the rest of it." She nodded slowly. "I need to get home," he said. "Mia's got a science project. Something about ecosystems. She's very serious about it. Tell her I said hi. She'll want to know if you're coming to the spring recital." Amelia blinked. "The spring recital." She mentioned it, he said with the flatness that she now recognized as his version of deliberate understatement. "Twice." She looked at him. "Tell her I'll be there," she said. He nodded, got in the truck, rolled down the window. Amelia. "Yeah." "You said something to me at Patty's. You said I want my engineers to learn how to listen." He looked at her steadily. "I think you already knew how. I think you'd just gotten busy." She stood there for a moment. "Drive safe," she said. He pulled out. She stood in the parking structure until the sound of the truck had faded completely. Then she stood there a little longer. She thought about 10 months. About where it had started a stutter in an engine, a 40-page report, a name on a notepad. About an old metal toolbox, and 4 minutes and 50 seconds, and the specific silence of a room that has just watched the impossible become simple. About a man who had never stopped being who he was, who had carried his father's knowledge into every room he had ever entered, and simply waited for someone to be ready to hear it. She thought about what it costs to listen. Really listen. Not to process and categorize and route into existing frameworks, but to be genuinely, actively, uncomfortably open to something you did not already know. It costs certainty. It costs the comfortable feeling that your existing knowledge is sufficient. It costs the small protective pride of being the most prepared person in the room. She had paid all of it. And what she had gotten in return, the 22%, the 11%, the 5 minutes, the $9 million worth of warranty costs, found in plain English in a customer complaint, was worth more than she had the words for in a quarterly report. She walked to her car. She thought about Raymond Cole working in that shop for 31 years, passing something down that he may not have known how to name, but that his son had carried forward with such total fidelity that it had survived everything. The grief, the years alone, the struggle of a small business, the long afternoons of ordinary work, and arrived intact in a 40,000 square foot performance center, in a conference room full of executives in an auditorium of 1,100 people. In every room Ethan Cole had walked into carrying that toolbox. Some knowledge lives in books. Some lives in data. Some lives in reports and frameworks and validated methodologies. And some lives only in people passed from hand to hand, from father to son, from teacher to student, through decades of standing beside machines and learning to hear what they are saying. That kind of knowledge does not get louder when you ignore it. It simply waits. Patient as a running engine, steady as a heartbeat, ready to be heard the moment someone finally stops talking and listens. Amelia Vaughn had built an empire on the belief that enough money could solve any problem. She had been wrong about that. Not entirely, not in every case, but in the way that matters most. She had confused the power to acquire knowledge with the wisdom to recognize it when it walked through her door in a flannel shirt, carrying an old toolbox, looking not at the equipment, but at the car. She was not wrong anymore. And that in the end was the thing that nobody had been able to fix with a budget or a consultant or a 40-page report. The thing that had taken one ordinary man with an extraordinary inheritance to set right. Not the clamp. Not the car. Her.